Let's bring in right now the staff writer of The Atlantic, Ashley Parker. She's also an MSNBC political analyst and chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker. His latest piece is out this morning. It's titled Trump 2.0 Heralds an Aggressive Flexing of Power. Why don't you talk about that, Peter? Because that's what most of Washington is talking about right now. What did you find?
Yeah, what I was looking at was how Trump 2.0 represents actually in a couple of ways, some pretty significant ideological shifts, right? A lot of what he's doing, he's done before, are extensions of what he's done before, things he's promised before. But in a couple important ways, we're seeing a different kind of Trump. One, of course, is this slash and burn attack on the federal government. Remember in his first term, Joe, you'll remember this, he wasn't much of a shrink the government kind of conservative. He wasn't doing very much, if anything, to pare back the scope and size of our federal state. Now suddenly they're shuttering agencies without congressional approval. They're, sending these young 20-somethings in to agencies left and right to just make wholesale changes and reductions without any input from lawmakers. And on the foreign front, we're seeing a different kind of America first, right? Instead of America first isolationism, we're seeing kind of an America first imperialism. Instead of focusing on things within our borders, he's now focused on expanding our borders. And so this is a different kind of Trump in that sense.
Well, and Peter, help us out on that, if you will, because he has always talked about how he thought America should come home, that he wasn't the imperialist. He'd always talk about Liz Cheney. When he attacked Liz Cheney, he would talk about Liz Cheney and other Republicans who were neocons. And that's, in fact, what sort of the Trump wing of the Republican Party was all about, which was doing less overseas, doing less outside the country. So I'm curious, this appears to have just cropped up post-election when we hear about Greenland, the Panama Canal, Canada, on and on and on. Any reporting on when that began developing in his strategic approach?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe, because I went back and looked at all of his public remarks, his speeches and rallies and interviews and so forth during the 24 campaign. Guess what? The word Greenland never came up, not once. And when he mentioned the Panama Canal, it was only in the context of how, Jimmy Carter made a bad decision, not that he was going to go take it back with, a naval fleet or something like that. And I didn't find any reference to Canada becoming the 51st state, much less the idea of taking over Gaza. Remember, that's the thing he floated just last week. Hard to imagine it was only a week ago, but that will be the biggest nation-building project the United States has taken on, certainly since the Iraq War. None of that came up during the campaign, but I think it represents a sort of flexing of power and a flexing of ambition that you're seeing in Trump in this second term, maybe as he's thinking about history. Maybe he's looking at the map. I mean, he did talk about Greenland at one point during the first term. We reported about it in our book, Susan Glasser, my wife and I. In fact, we asked him about that once in an interview. What attracted you? He said, well, I looked at the map and I saw this great real estate and I thought it was really interesting. But he didn't really make that big of a public show about it. This time it seemed to be a recurring theme because whether it goes anywhere or not, it reflects, I think, a more global ambition than he used to have.
I also want to talk about domestically how ideologically he actually is more, let's just say, he's following traditionally conservative ideas on, when I say traditionally conservative ideas, let me just say that you and I have heard in Washington for 30 years. So, like, go after foreign aid. Right. Cut government spending, cut the government workforce. These are not ideas that he's obsessed on. It seems to me a real indication that he is following the 2025 playbook that was laid out for him by Heritage. These are all traditional heritage ideas and not things that he's talked about. Of course, the grave concern is how he's going about doing that outside of sort of the constitutional boundaries of Article 1 spending powers. Talk about that, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, you'll remember that Ronald Reagan talked about getting rid of the Department of Education, for instance, and the Department of Energy. Other conservatives have talked about the USAID over the years. A couple of big differences. One, of course, is that Ronald Reagan would never have done it without Congress. He would never have attempted to simply, on his own dime, shut down an agency funded and authorized by Congress without their approval. And the other big thing is, I think, the way Trump and his people are framing it. He actually doesn't frame it necessarily so much as about shrinking the government and you know, the less is better kind of view of conservatism, which is traditional and roots itself in the Reagan era. He's talking about it in more of an attack on the deep state, right? So Russ Vought, his new budget director, produced a document in 2023 saying, you know, going after the woke and weaponized government, not against the overly large government or the government as too intrusive. It's against the woke government. So he's framing it as a culture war battle. And he's also, of course, looking at it in terms of retribution against a government that he believes tried to thwart him in his first term and tried to indict and prosecute him in his 4-year interregnum.
So, Ashley, the other track of action here is the rooting out of DEI, which is now a very bad word, according to the Trump administration. And you're writing a little bit about how that's manifesting itself in how he's making changes, that's putting it lightly, at the Kennedy Center. Tell us about it.
That's right. So we broke the news a couple hours before Trump truthed it that he planned to fire a number of board members at the Kennedy Center and appoint himself chairman. And part of this is a reaction from 4 years ago when Trump was the only president who did not attend a single Kennedy Center honors. And part of that was because, you know, in his first term, a number of the artists and honorees said they would boycott the awards. They would boycott the reception at the White House. And he just sort of said, fine, I'm not going to go. And this time around, the attitude was described to us as very different. The idea was, Melania and I are not going to be the ones who don't go to the Kennedy Center because you don't like us. We're going to take it over, you know, just because, as someone put it, just because Robert De Niro doesn't want us to come, he was an honoree, we're still going to come and we're going to remake it in our own image. And going back to your question about DEI, it was notable that in his truth statement, he said one of his reasons for wanting to sort of remake this crown jewel of American culture was because they had put on a drag show performance. And so it was sort of saying, not only is he getting rid of these board members who Biden appointed, people like Mike Donilon, his chief strategist, or Karine Jean-Pierre, his press secretary, and becoming chair, but the stuff that he is going to want to show at the Kennedy Center is going to be in line with that cultural war that Peter was just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's bring into the conversation contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, Ben Rhodes. He served as Deputy National Security Advisor under President Barack Obama. And your guest essay, Ben, for the Times is entitled, "This Isn't the Donald Trump America Elected?" And you write in part this: many Americans, myself included, support overhauling the sclerotic national security consensus that has governed our policies since September 11th, 2001. Yet it would be wrong to dismiss Mr. Trump's dizzying array of pronouncements and executive actions on foreign policy as simply the fulfillment of his campaign promises. He did not run on the dismantling of USAID, the conquest of Greenland, or the occupation of Gaza. Rather than showing strength, his foreign policy betrays a loss of American self-confidence and self-respect, eliminating any pretense that the United States stands for the things it has claimed to support since fighting 2 world wars: freedom, self-determination, and collective security. In many ways, Mr. Trump cuts a more familiar picture from history: an aging strongman musing about territorial expansion to consolidate power and cement his legacy. And Joe, you know, I'll let you take it to Ben, but, you know, he is using issues, I think, that on the surface, at least, run quite well politically with the right: foreign aid, government waste, immigration, even tariffs and DEI. These are in some ways winning issues on the right and do apply to his campaign promises.
Right. I think, and Ben, you point this out, in part, some of it is the way he's going about doing it. Obviously, real concerns with that, with what Elon Musk is doing. But I'll follow up with you. The question I asked Peter Baker, which is when you talk about Gaza, when you talk about Greenland, when you talk about the Panama Canal, when you talk about Canada, these actually run counter to the sort of America first foreign policy approach he's always preached on the campaign trail and in interviews, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, this was not just a series of accidents either, Joe. I mean, this is a man who, in his scripted inaugural address, said this was going to be an era of, quote, territorial expansion. This is clearly something he's been thinking about. And the couple of things that jumped out to me are first of all, this point that if you look at other autocrats around the world throughout all of human history, including in recent years, when you look at, say, Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, or how Xi Jinping is eyeing Taiwan ever more closely as he ages a bit, you know, there's this idea that a real legacy comes with more territory. That's not a new concept. It both helps you consolidate power at home. It stirs up nationalism. You get a bit of a sugar high. And it also is something that, you know, you can associate yourself with going forward. I also make the point, though, that this is hardly strength here, Joe. This is like a bully in the schoolyard looking around for someone small to push around. You know, so far we've had Greenland and Denmark. We've had Canada and Mexico. We had the brief spat with Colombia. These are not people in the United States' weight class when it comes to great power conflict. So there's something even more unsettling about it, because this is not superpower behavior. This is autocratic behavior, and it's frankly kind of declining superpower behavior to be looking for someone kind of smaller to push around like this.